And without further ado, I want to introduce Rebecca Larson of SoCal Realty Law. Becca is a shareholder, partner, and attorney here, as well as our resident property tax specialist. And today she's presenting in our second webinar in this series called Pitfalls in Property Transfers, the Property Tax Edition. Take it away, Becca.
Thanks, Shanna. As Shanna mentioned, I'm one of the shareholders at SoCal Realty Law. Thank you so much for joining us today in the second part of our webinar series. This one's all about the taxes. I've been playing a little joke with myself and making it sound like it's from Friends, the one with the taxes. A little bit about myself. As Shanna mentioned, I'm one of the shareholders. I'm licensed to practice here in California. I'm also licensed in Virginia and the District of Columbia. I've been with SoCal Realty Law for 1 year as of tomorrow. So today is sort of a pre-anniversary party with all of our favorite people.
Woo woo!
Yeah, so tomorrow is my 1 year anniversary with SoCal. It's very exciting. It's been an excellent year, and we hope to do more of these webinars so you can learn more about our business. So a little bit about our business. Shanna and I own this. Between the two of us, we've got 30 years so of experience serving Southern California community. We primarily work with real estate. So literally everything that touches the dirt, that's us. Our primary practice is serving homeowners, investors, real estate professionals in pretty much anything you can think of. Purchase and sale agreements, disputes with their homeowners associations, seller fraud issues, and then helping homeowners with mortgage distress. So short sales, loan modifications, dealing with California Homeowners Bill of Rights. About 40% of our practice is landlord services, where we're working with landlords in their investments. So we're helping them prepare their leases. We're helping them deal with risk mitigation, which includes our eviction services. So we'll help evict tenants, for non-payment of rent. If you've been following us for the last 6 months or so, we've developed a Landlords Need to Know webinar series where we talk all about landlords and how we can serve them, especially in this environment. Last month, August 31st, Governor Newsom signed some new laws that directly impact landlords in California. September 3rd, we hosted an awesome webinar about it. We can drop a link in the chat with a link to our YouTube channel so you can check out the Landlords Need to Know webinar series. And stay tuned because there will be more events throughout the year geared specifically for landlords. So a little plug about that. Let's move on to today. So today we're talking about taxes. We're going to set up some basics about how property taxes are calculated and some historical and relevant information about the taxing process in California. We'll talk about Prop 13 from 1978. And then later in the presentation, most of the presentation is really going to be about the 2020 election ballot measures. And those are Prop 15 and Prop 19. They affect residential and commercial property and industrial property. And they are going to have some pretty significant impacts on property owners in California if both of these props pass. All right. So property taxes. Where does your money go? Property taxes between 1912 and about 1933 in California, all of that money or a significant portion of that money went into the general fund for the state. After 1933, then it went down and trickled down into the municipalities, so your cities, your counties, your school districts. About 25% of tax revenue that's collected in the state of California goes towards funding schools, which is usually the hot button topic that people are talking about when they're talking about property taxes. How much money is it going to fund for schools? Surprisingly, it's significantly lower than most of the country. Because we're talking about taxes and taxes are kind of dry, I thought I would include a fun fact about property taxes in California. Because California does not apply property taxes to the general fund anymore, one of the properties that they do use the tax revenues to fund general funds are for the taxes of private rail cars. Private rail cars are those that are owned not by Amtrak or Union Pacific. These are owned by individuals or private companies. In 2020, they collected about $10 million worth of tax revenue from about $1.5 billion worth of assets. And I had to do the math, and I said, well, how much is the value of a private rail car? And the The average is about $42,000, so they're taxing it. But I just thought that was pretty interesting that private rail cars generate $10 million worth of tax revenue for the state. Something else to consider for property taxes, if you're in San Diego, you know Chula Vista. Chula Vista is this community that's just south of the city. It's a pretty wide swath between the coast and the eastern mountain border. And then there's our south border with Mexico. There's a little strip of the city that's just on the border. But Chula Vista in itself is this big chunk of land that was developed pretty high density residential and commercial. What they have done to fund that project is impose Mello-Roos, MELLOROS taxes. And what Mello-Roos taxes are is exactly that. It's a developmental tax. So it's a special tax that's collected with your regular property tax bill, and it's used to fund that development project. A lot of times, and especially in Chula Vista, depending on what part of Chula Vista you're in and what part of the development, your Mello-Roos taxes can be higher than your regular base rate taxes. I've seen instances where it's significantly higher. The plus side of the Mello-Roos is that it expires at some point in time, usually between 20 and 30 years. But that's to help fund that development. And that includes, the infrastructure, so the roads, the sewers, the power, the services, so the schools, the fire departments, the police departments. That's what the Mello-Roos tax does. And what it helps prevent other areas from having to absorb the cost of developing that area. So that's another element of property taxes and where that money goes to. If you look at a property tax bill, it'll also itemize all the other stuff that your money goes towards: vector control, so pest control, your special districts for water, your special districts for the schools and the libraries, and any special bonds that were voted on by the residents of that community. Those are all itemized in your tax bill. All right. So where we need to start is 1978. 1978 is a really important year in California because Prop 13 was on the ballot. And we're going to talk a lot about the election from 1978 and today, this year, because it matters. In 1978, California was running about a $10 billion surplus in their budget. And what that did was spawn outrage from homeowners and property owners in California saying, we're paying way too much tax. There's no reason we need to be paying this much tax. Do something about it. And the product of that was Prop 13. What it did when it passed was it rolled back the property values for residential and commercial properties to 1975 values. So if a house in 1978 was worth $24,000, 1975 it was worth $20,000, that's where the benchmark starts. So in 1978, that tax rate is now $20,000. What it also did was put a cap on how much your property taxes can go up every year. So you have your base rate, and then it can't go up more than 1% plus local approved bonds. There's this magical cap at 2%. So what it does is it keeps the property tax value low for an extremely long time. This has been in place for the last 42 years in California. And we'll talk a little bit more about what it actually looks like. We'll talk about my friend John later. The properties can be reassessed. There are certain triggers for that. The most common is a change of ownership. So you have an owner of a property and they sell it to somebody else. That's a change of ownership that triggers a reassessment. Another reason that could trigger a reassessment is completion of new construction. This happens a lot with tear down. The property would have been taking benefit of the Prop 13 tax basis. Once that property is destroyed, a new structure is put on there, the county will come in and reassess it. So why does Prop 13 matter right now? Because in 2020, there are two measures that are on the ballot that are going to directly impact how these tax rates are calculated. But before we do that, we have to talk about four other ones because those also have to play into what's going to happen later this year. After 1978, there were a run of 4 other propositions that affected how you can take advantage of the low tax basis. One of the things that we do here at SoCal is we handle a lot of parent-child transfers. And what that is mom and dad. So we have a picture here of of a daughter and a father and a grandchild. So the father wants to transfer to his daughter the house behind him. We'll help them facilitate that transfer. And then the added benefit is that the daughter now gets to take advantage of the tax basis that dad had on that property. So the house behind is not actually a great representation because it looks like it's a newer home. The homes that have been in the family homes that have been in this particular family for the last 50 or 70 years. I had a call recently with a client who the family home has been in the family for 80 years, and is taking advantage of this proposition, because the taxes for a property that market value is over $1 million, they're paying about $400 in property taxes. This is where it all plays in. So Prop 58 is the proposition that allows parents to transfer to children or spouses to transfer to one another without triggering a reassessment. I'm going to jump down to the bottom. Prop 193 allows a grandparent or grandparents to transfer to the grandchildren, and not trigger a reassessment, but only if the grandchild's parents, both of them, have predeceased. It's interesting because there's also this $1 million exclusion, which says, the property can be anything over $1 million. They'll only reassess the value over the $1 million. Propositions 60 and 90 relate to one another. And this is primarily for folks who are 55 and older. There are some other exclusions for severe disabilities and folks who have been affected by natural disasters, where it allows them to transfer their tax basis from their original home to a replacement home. The limitations, at least through Propositions 60 and 90, have been in Proposition 60, the replacement home, so the new home, needs to be within the same county. And it also needs to be of equal or lesser value than the original home. If you've been in that home for a really long time, can be very, very hard to meet. Proposition 90, on the other hand, allows the homeowner who meets the same criteria, 55 and older, or some of these other qualifying events, allows you to transfer your value to a replacement property in another county within California, but only if the county agrees. There are a handful of counties that will do transfers, inter-county transfers, but there are not many. So there's a broad stroke overview about what we're dealing with for property taxes. There's really 5 that have a pretty great impact on how we handle taxes here in California. 13, which sets the base value, and then the 4 that we just covered, transferring and how to avoid reassessment. I'm going to take a little break because we're going to talk about some heavy stuff coming up. But part of this election, and this is just a little joke about legislation. I'm 400 pages of new stuff. You better hurry up. They're writing new rules all over me. Christ, what's in you, Bill? These 2 propositions that we're going to be talking about that are on the ballot measure for California have gone through a lot of changes. Most recently, the one that we're going to talk about on Prop 19, which deals with residential properties specifically, has had adjustments made to it as late as last month, where they threw in some incentives to a particular group, which is changing the nature of how this is going to happen. So it's important to stay on top of what's going on, because even if you don't own property in California and you live in California, you're benefiting from the services that are provided by the tax revenue that's generated from the property taxes. So let's get into Prop 15. Prop 15, I think, is probably one of the most polarizing and probably has the most important financial impact on the state of California if it passes. And what it is, or what they were calling it, is tax on commercial and industrial properties for education and local government funding. And that's a mouthful. But what it essentially does is it reassesses commercial and industrial properties to current value. So it's going to look back to properties who may have been benefiting from Prop 13 42 years ago and reassess it to new market value. And we'll go through identifying what types of properties qualify for this and how it's really going to work a little bit later. If it passes in November, the first tax year that it will apply is not this next year, 2021. It'll start in 2022. So first payments are due December 2022 for the reassessment. There is a delay for certain businesses to 2025, and that relates entirely to what type of business actually owns the property. One of the most compelling things that they're talking about for Proposition 15 is that if they do this, it's expected to bring in annually $6.5 to $11.5 billion, with a B, billion dollars in new funding for schools and local governments. And that's something that it's great for our communities, being able to fund our schools and being able to improve our infrastructure. On the other side, looking at people who own property, to go from a property, like I mentioned earlier, with the house that's currently assessed, or that was assessed at $20,000 in 1978. In 2020, the tax values on that property is less than $50,000. And you can have the same type of value on a commercial or industrial property depending on when they bought it and where they bought it. So you're looking at on a tax basis going from $300 or $400 a year in property taxes to bringing it up to value. So that $50,000 house or that $50,000 commercial building now, if it were to be reassessed, is going to go from next to nothing to being taxed at whatever the base rate is. So for residential properties in San Diego, excuse me, and this is about average for the state of California, it's 0.757%. That's right. It's under 1%, which is about a quarter of a point less than the national average. National average for residential property tax is about 1%. So it would trigger the reassessment, not necessary for Prop 15, but to think about how the math is going to work. Prop 13 house, $50,000 now, $300 or $400 taxes annually. To bring it up to market, let's say that house is now worth $1.7 million. The property tax value is going to go from $50,000 to $1.7, $300 a year tax bill to nearly $5,000 a year in taxes. And the reason why, at least for the commercial and the industrial properties, is the tax values are going to go up significantly more. The values of those properties are going to go up significantly more. And the money might not be there. So you're going to force people out of properties that they've owned for a really long time. You're going to put the owners in a position to not have the cash to pay the taxes, which is going to potentially turn it into default. And right now you're looking at, on the commercial side, specifically on the commercial side, dealing with tenants who can't pay. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the taxes. It has everything to do with our current economic climate and what's going on with COVID. So when you add in the layer of commercial tenants not being able to meet their rental obligations on a normal day, which could include payments towards their property taxes, because if they're paying common areas, or if they're paying taxes as part of their lease agreement, that is based off of what it's currently assessed at. You go in and reassess it, and now you're sticking these tenants with significantly higher tax bills to cover. The burden's going to fall on the tenant. We're going to have defaults for tenants. We're going to have defaults for landlords. It has the potential to be a giant disaster. So the bad side of it is that. The good side of it is it is a lot of revenue that this state needs in order to improve the infrastructure, especially for our schools. Let's talk about some of the essentials of Prop 15. So is anyone excluded from this proposition? Yes, all residential properties. And when I read that, there was a big question mark. What is a residential property? Are they going to look at, the high rises that are in downtown? Are they going to look at multifamily? Are they going to look at mixed use? Are those going to be considered residential? So the basis is it's all residential properties, regardless if it's occupied by a homeowner or a tenant. It also excludes all agricultural properties. So if it's zoned for commercial or industrial and it's used for agricultural purposes, it's also excluded from this reassessment. So what qualifies as a residential property? Single-family homes, which would include townhouses and condominiums, multi-unit dwellings. So we're talking 1 to 4 units, anything that's those types of buildings. And this was the thing that I thought was the most valuable part of this, is that they're treating properties that are zoned for commercial use, but used for long-term residential housing. They're categorizing them as residential and exempt from this reassessment. And I thought it was really important that they said long-term residential housing, because what this does is it carves out and says hotels, you're not included. You're going to be reassessed under this proposition. But what it does is it protects the big residential buildings, the ones that have a couple hundred or a couple thousand units in it, from being reassessed and brought up to market. It also protects the small ones. If you've got 20 units or 20 doors and it's sitting on commercially zoned property, it's a commercially zoned unit and it has residential long-term housing, it's not going to be reassessed. So it's going to help protect some of this. It could potentially help protect some of the smaller owned properties. One of the other interesting carve outs that they have for this is it protects people who have smaller portfolios. So they'll look at the aggregate portfolio that this particular client has, or this particular taxpayer has. And if the aggregate portfolio is less than $3 million for the commercial and industrial properties, they'll be exempt as well. That $3 million is also adjusted for inflation every 2 or 3 years. I think it's every 2 years. So the dollar amount will go up. So those are some of the essentials about how 15 will work, is that the commercial and industrial properties will be reassessed. These are the exemptions. So all residential, including single family and mixed use, multi-unit and residential zoned commercial. One of the other things, so some other fun facts. I want to talk about mixed use properties first, because that's one of the other issues is, well, what about my property that has commercial space on the ground floor and I have 500 doors above it? If the commercial building if the mixed use building contains long-term housing, so not a hotel, long-term housing above it or in that parcel, they will carve that out and only reassess the commercial portions of that building. There's also an added exemption if your mixed use building is 75% or more residential. You can apply for a 100% exemption. So they won't even reassess that 25% or less of the commercial space. Some other things that were sort of, I thought more like bait or an extra incentive for commercial and industrial property owners to take advantage of, is there's going to be a new $500,000 exemption for tangible personal properties and fixtures. So not only are you taxed on the actual building that you own, you're also taxed on the stuff that your business owns. So your computers, your equipment, your fixtures. If you're in a restaurant, all the stuff that you have in your kitchen. The things that they did carve out of that, the exemption doesn't include boats or airplanes. But that was an interesting way that they're going to try and offset some of this value, is that there's going to be a tax credit, this $500,000 exemption, which is huge. $500,000 exemption for the tangible personal property. One of the other things was, how often is my property going to be reassessed? And they said no less than every 3 years. So they The problem with that is if they don't reassess it every year, that third year could be a huge hit. So if you go from 2020, at this point, 2022 to 2025, the values could significantly increase. And if you don't reassess every year, to catch up that bill, it's going to be a big hit. California does something, which I'm not familiar with it happening other places, but I'm sure it could. California loves supplemental tax bills. So if your property is reassessed, they'll send you I call them catch-up bills, supplemental tax bills, to make sure that you're paying the correct amount of taxes. And they'll base that off of whatever the prior assessed value is and whatever this new one is. So not only do you pay your supplemental tax bills, you pay your regular taxes as well. Something that I think is on the mind of a lot of people is how is this going to affect short-term rentals or using a residential property or residential building for business purposes. This is something that would affect us. Working from home, and a lot of people now working from home because of the stay-at-home orders. They're carving that out. If you work from home or you have a home-based business in a residential property, they're not going to treat you as a commercial property subject to this reassessment. If you have a short-term rental and you're using it as an investment property, they're not going to treat that as commercial. So you would also be exempt. The same thing with residential properties being used as, if you have a second home or you have an investment property, that all gets scooped up under that residential property, regardless if it's occupied by the homeowner or a tenant. So those were just some of the things about Prop 15 that I thought were really interesting that can really have an impact on how you want to view this. There are, from the conversations that I've had with a lot of commercial real estate brokers, is that there is a lot of trepidation about this because it has such significant impacts on being able to maintain the business, especially if they've had that asset in the portfolio for a really long time. For the properties that are purchased and sold quickly, it really doesn't make much difference because they're already at market rate. But long term, especially on the bigger commercial projects, you don't buy those with the anticipation that you're going to turn around and sell it in a year or 2 years. You're buying it with the anticipation that this is going to be a long-term asset, a long-term income asset producing piece of property, and you want to hold on to it because you see the value in it. So it makes things a little more challenging when you're planning that way, and you're spending that much money in taxes. Okay, moving on to Prop 19. Prop 19 is what we talked about earlier with Prop 13. They all play together. Wanted to mention one other thing before we move on to Prop 19. One of the primary objectives of Prop 15 is to preserve the Prop 13. Prop 13 benefits to property owners, especially to residential property owners. And I find it really interesting that we have two competing propositions that directly relate to and affect Proposition 13. One says, Proposition 15, we want to protect a homeowner's ability to retain the benefits of Proposition 13. Proposition 19, on the other hand, is what we're going to talk about next, addresses Proposition 13, and then the four other big ones that we talked about earlier that related to parent-child transfers, grandparent to grandchild transfers, and then transferring your tax basis to other homes. I found it interesting that one of the things that 15 is trying to avoid is affecting the homeowner's right to take advantage of the Prop 13 tax basis. And then here we have 19, which is, it's not gutting it, but it's making it significantly harder for people to do what they have been doing here for the last 42 years, which is estate planning. And estate planning is not part of our business, but it is tangentially related in that we end up doing a part of that process. And that's the parent-child transfers or the grandparent-grandchild transfers. So what's changing with Prop 19? One of the biggest differences, and this is actually, I think, probably one of the best benefits of Prop 19, is for the senior protection. For homeowners aged 55 and older, they can transfer currently, they can only transfer to a property within their county to a property, a new replacement property that's equal or less value than the original. And California home prices are insane. So it can be very challenging for that homeowner to find a tax basis to meet that or match that. So what it's doing now, what Prop 19 is proposing, is they can transfer their primary residence first to anywhere in the state without needing approval from that county. The second is allowing that person to go into a more expensive home. And what they would do is they would do an upward adjustment for the difference. So rather than losing it entirely, they get to save the benefit of, let's say they bought a house in the 90s. In the 90s, the property tax was $190,000. And now that house is, well over $1 million. What they can do is they can move that tax basis up to 3 times. Currently, it's only 1. They can move that tax basis up to 3 times to different replacement properties. And if it's a more expensive home, the catch-up is only the difference between the full cash value of the original and the replacement. So it allows for them to at least retain some of that benefit. The transfers to kids and grandkids, so the parent-child transfers and the grandparent-grandchild transfers, this is where it gets a little stickier, because a lot of times, at least what we're experiencing, is there's a transfer of generational wealth, and it's not done through traditional means, cash. I'm not giving you a bucket full of cash to transfer my assets to you. What they're doing is families are purchasing or acquiring through inheritance or, through their own investment measures, a pretty sweet portfolio of properties, residential, commercial, industrial, doesn't matter. And what they can do, especially for the parent-child, they can transfer it regardless whether that child's going to occupy the property as their primary residence. So it can be a second home. It can be an investment property. This is really important as far as the commercial properties go because the value can be significantly more. So what they're doing with the Props 58 and 193, so those are the parents and the grandparent propositions, is they're going to limit those transfers to only the child or the grandchild must occupy that property as a primary residence. If it's going to be an investment property or a second home, it's going to trigger a reassessment. So, and the proposed statute does not go through the process as far as what documentation you must prove, with the exception of you must claim the homeowner's exemption, which is a $7,000, as of today, a $7,000 credit that you get off of your tax bill. They reduced the amount of the assessment by $7,000 to account for the homeowner exemption. You have to claim that. And if you don't claim that, and if you don't claim that in time, they treat that as you saying, this is not what I intended to do I didn't intend for it to be my primary residence, and it would trigger a reassessment. I need to look a little closer to find out what the timing is on that. As far as how soon after the transfer do you need to make that election. One of the other things that was unclear was, do you have to go through the same parent-child or grandparent-child exclusion process that you currently have to? An entire application process that you have to use in order to take advantage of this exclusion. The $1 million exclusion is treated the same way as the transfer of basis for folks that are 55 and older. So you can transfer up to $1 million in the aggregate of value to a child or a grandchild. Anything over that, the only thing that they're going to tax is the difference. So that's where the upward adjustment comes from. This proposition, even though they tout it as being a great generator of revenue, it's not as nearly as impactful as the Proposition 15 tax benefit. Prop 19, they're only estimating millions, maybe hundreds of millions, but the direct impact is not as great as the Prop 15. And what it does is it really cuts off the amount of wealth that is being transferred. Let's see. Sorry, I didn't have my little queue up for the next one. So that's in a nutshell what's going on right now in California as far as property taxes go, Prop 15 and Prop 19, and how they're going to affect, how things have been done in the last 40 plus years here. We will, let's see. I said about wraps it up for the content. Use the next few weeks to read up on the bill, on the propositions, and, figure out where you stand on it. And you have to vote. That's the other thing. Just vote, please. So I'm going to wrap up the content here. This is us. Me and Shanna and Zach, our associates. If you need to contact us, we are totally virtual. Even before all this, we're a virtual firm. We're located in Tier Santa. Feel free to give us a call if you have any questions. As far as the transfers go, I'm going to jump back into Prop 19. Those transfers will start February 16 if this passes. Transfers after February 16, 2021 will be scooped up under this new law. So if you do have any planning needs, give us a call. We can do an assessment to figure out where you are and possibly plug you in with an estate planning attorney as well to make sure that everything is done according to your plans and that you all fill out paperwork correctly. So that's the other thing, is that if this is something that you've been on the fence about, you need to take action now, either in the form of voting, becoming more educated about these propositions, and actually doing it. So that's it. Give us a call. Check us out on the website. Thank you.